A woman in designer sunglasses strides toward a pristine Navy patrol boat, citation pad in hand. Her voice drips with authority as she warns about HOA violations. The camera cuts to a military officer's face, stone cold, unimpressed. Then comes the reveal, a massive American flag snapping in the wind, gleaming federal insignia catching the light. Her confident smile freezes. The officer's words cut through the silence. "Ma'am, you just threatened federal property. Do you understand what you've done?" The screen cuts to black. A single sound, the distant rumble of an engine. The morning sun hung low over Crescent Bay, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Sycamore Heights, a gated community where every blade of grass was measured to exactly 3 inches and every mailbox faced true north. Patricia Holloway had lived here for 12 years, and in that time, she'd become the neighborhood's de facto enforcer of perfection. She stood at her kitchen window with a steaming cup of organic chamomile tea, her eyes scanning the waterfront properties like a hawk hunting for weakness. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back so tightly, it seemed to lift her entire face into an expression of perpetual disapproval. At 58, she transformed herself into an instrument of compliance, armed with the HOA bylaws and an encyclopedic knowledge of every restriction, covenant, and amendment. That's when she saw it. A sleek military patrol boat had been moored at the Martinez property overnight. The waterfront estate that had sat empty for 6 months since the owner, Commander Daniel Martinez, had been reassigned to Naval Base San Diego. Patricia's mind immediately began cataloging violations. Unmarked vessel. No registration visible from her vantage point. The faded blue hull that didn't match the community's approved nautical aesthetic of navy, white, and chrome. She didn't check the property records. She didn't make a single phone call to verify ownership. Patricia simply opened her leather portfolio, withdrew a citation form, and began writing in her precise, aggressive handwriting. At the marina office, she pulled the file for the Martinez property. The boat wasn't listed under the homeowner's name. It was federal documentation. The details were sparse, but Patricia saw only an obstacle. She'd dealt with difficult homeowners before. She'd levied fines against a retired couple for painting their shutters taupe instead of colonial taupe. She'd forced a family to remove a rose garden because roses violated the architectural harmony ordinance. Patricia never backed down. By 10 in the morning, she was at the property with her citation in hand, her posture rigid with righteousness. The dock was empty except for the boat. She marched directly to it, her heels clicking against the weathered wood with the rhythm of a judge's gavel. The morning breeze carried the salt smell of the bay, but Patricia barely noticed. She was already mentally calculating the fine, $500 for the first violation, $250 per day thereafter. She taped the citation to the boat's windshield with the satisfaction of a hunter posting a trophy. The paper fluttered slightly, but held. Patricia took a photo with her phone, documentation for the HOA records, and turned to leave, her duty fulfilled in her mind. She didn't see the figure emerging from the cabin below. Commander Daniel Martinez had returned to the boat early that morning, unable to sleep in his temporary rental while finalizing paperwork for his new position. He was 42, weathered by 20 years of naval service, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside. His jaw was squared, his eyes carried the weight of command, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who'd worked for every rank he'd earned. He'd been reviewing charts when he heard the footsteps. When he climbed topside, he found Patricia halfway back up the dock. "Excuse me," he called out. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried absolute authority. "Is there something I can help you with?" Patricia turned slowly, her expression hardening. This would be a confrontation. She could feel it. She'd faced resistance before, and she'd always prevailed. "I've issued a citation for this vessel," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "It's in violation of community standards, unmarked, unauthorized, and detracting from the visual aesthetic of the waterfront district." Daniel climbed onto the dock with measured steps. He was still in civilian clothes, jeans, and a weathered navy athletic jacket, but something about his bearing made Patricia's certainty flicker just slightly. "Citation," he glanced back at the boat, then at her. "Who are you?" "Patricia Holloway, Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association. I enforce community codes. That vessel needs to be removed or brought into compliance within 72 hours, or fines will accumulate at $250 per day." Daniel's eyes narrowed. He walked past her to the boat and examined the citation. For a long moment he said nothing. When he turned back to face her, there was something new in his expression, not anger, but something colder. Disappointment, perhaps. The look of a man watching someone cross a line they didn't understand existed. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "do you have any idea what you're looking at?" Patricia straightened her spine. An unmarked boat in violation of... "A United States Navy patrol vessel," he interrupted, his voice now carrying the edge of command. "This is federal property, registered with Naval Operations Command. You've just threatened to fine the United States government." The blood drained from Patricia's face, but she forced herself to stand firm, even as doubt began to crack her certainty like ice on a thawing lake. "There's no registration visible." "It's below the waterline," Daniel said. "Federal marking, you wouldn't be able to see it without proper authorization." He stepped closer, his voice low and deadly calm. "And you've just interfered with federal property. Do you understand what you've done?" Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came. For the first time in 12 years of HOA authority, she had no authority at all. By noon, Commander Martinez's phone call to Naval Base San Diego had triggered a response that moved with the precision of military machinery. Within 2 hours, 3 officers in dress uniforms arrived at Sycamore Heights. They didn't come to the marina. They came directly to Patricia's home. The knock on her door was formal, professional, final. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen stood on Patricia's porch with the file in her hands, her expression carefully neutral. Behind her, 2 ensigns remained at attention on the driveway. Patricia had watched enough military-themed television to know she was outmatched, but she couldn't quite make herself believe it. "Ms. Holloway," Chen began, "I'm here to inform you that you've made contact with federal property and attempted to levy fines against the United States government. This falls under Federal Code 18 U.S.C. Section 641. Do you understand?" Patricia's mouth was dry. "I didn't know." "That's unfortunately not a legal defense," Chen said without inflection. "However, Commander Martinez has elected not to pursue charges provided you take immediate action." She held up the citation Patricia had issued. "You're going to withdraw this. You're going to issue a formal apology to the HOA membership, and you're going to step down from your position immediately." "Step down? That's not fair. I was doing my job." "Your job ended when you issued a citation to federal property," Chen said coldly. "Commander Martinez served his country for 20 years. This vessel is part of his work. If you push this further, we will pursue legal action, and I guarantee you'll wish we hadn't." The ensigns didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough. By evening, Patricia had drafted the apology and sent notification of her resignation to the HOA board. She wrote it with trembling hands, each word a humiliation. The withdrawal of the citation was filed with official documentation stating it had been issued in error. But resignation from a volunteer position wasn't the real consequence. The real consequence was what happened the next morning when the story circulated through Sycamore Heights. One of the ensigns had mentioned the incident to a friend. That friend texted another resident. By breakfast time, every homeowner in the community knew that Patricia Holloway had tried to fine the United States Navy. The next HOA meeting was called for emergency session. Patricia sat in the back of the community center, watching as the board president read the formal record of her violations: abuse of authority, misuse of HOA resources, and failure to verify basic facts before issuing sanctions. A parade of residents spoke. The couple with the rose garden, now revived in their front yard. The family who'd been forced to repaint their shutters. A widow who'd been fined $1,200 for having her grandchildren's toy in her driveway overnight. Each story was a brick in the wall that was collapsing around Patricia. The vote to formally investigate her conduct was unanimous, 23 in favor, 0 opposed. Patricia left the meeting before the final vote on potential criminal charges through the board. She drove home with her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. That evening her phone began ringing. It didn't stop. Former neighbors calling to express their relief. The local news requesting an interview. A lawyer calling on behalf of residents who wanted to pursue civil damages for her past abuses. She turned off her phone. But the silence was worse than the noise. In her kitchen, surrounded by the pristine appliances and designer fixtures she'd purchased with the pride of a woman who'd built her life on control, Patricia sat in darkness. For 12 years, she'd been the arbiter of perfection. For 12 years, she'd been the most powerful person in her community. In a single moment, she'd become its punchline. The real turning point came 3 days later when she received a certified letter from the HOA's legal counsel. They were opening a formal investigation into whether her abuse of authority constituted fraud. They were examining every citation she'd ever issued, every fine she'd collected, every person she'd targeted. They were requesting restitution for those harmed. Patricia realized that her war against every tiny perceived imperfection had been fought against the backdrop of a colossal blindness. She'd never once looked beyond her own certainty to question whether she was right. The woman who'd spent 12 years enforcing perfection now had to face the most imperfect thing of all, herself. The investigation moved like a slow-motion avalanche. Patricia's attorney advised her to cooperate fully, hopping for leniency. She pulled every record, every citation, every photograph she'd taken of supposed violations. More than 800 documented cases over 12 years. The HOA's legal team cross-referenced them against the actual bylaws and community standards. What they found was staggering. 70% of Patricia's citations had been issued for violations that didn't technically exist or had been grossly misinterpreted. The rose garden, not prohibited. She'd simply added a clause to the architectural harmony bylaw on her own authority. The taupe shutters. The original HOA guidelines didn't specify color beyond earth tones. Patricia had fabricated an entire secondary code that existed only in her mind and her enforcement notebook. The HOA opened a settlement fund. Residents began filing claims. The first payment went to the elderly couple with the roses, $4, $200 in fines, plus 5 years of accumulated court costs in fighting her citations. The widow received $6,500. A young family that had moved away rather than endure more harassment received a letter offering $8,000 in restitution. Patricia had to pay for it herself. Her legal bills alone exceeded $35,000 in the first month. But something worse than financial ruin was happening to Patricia's psyche. She'd begun receiving emails from neighbors, not threatening, which might have made her angry, but something far more damaging, pity mixed with contempt. "I always respected you," one neighbor wrote, someone Patricia had personally mentored in HOA procedures. "I thought you were trying to protect our community's value. Now I realize you were just power-hungry." Another email came from the family with the shutters. "We almost didn't move here because of you. My daughter wanted to paint her room bright yellow. We said no because we thought the HOA was real. I wasted 2 years being afraid of you." Patricia stopped reading her emails after that. She couldn't go to the community grocery store without feeling the weight of stares. The yoga studio she'd attended for 6 years sent a letter informing her they'd decided to restructure their membership. The book club she'd founded, the book club, sent notice that she was no longer welcome due to community concerns. She'd spent 12 years being central to everything in Sycamore Heights. Now she was toxic. By the 3rd week, Patricia had made the decision. She would sell the house, start over somewhere else, somewhere no one knew what she'd done. That's when the criminal referral came through. The district attorney's office had been contacted by the HOA's legal team. Patricia's pattern of behavior, the fabrication of rules, the systematic enforcement against specific residents, the collection of fines based on false regulations, constituted civil fraud. There was also the matter of the federal incident. Her threat against federal property, even if unintentional, had been documented by military personnel. The DA's office didn't charge her with anything federal. They didn't need to. Instead, they opened a fraud investigation into whether Patricia had been embezzling HOA funds through the fines she collected and never properly logged. She hadn't been, technically, but her record-keeping was so poor, so deliberately obscured through her personal filing system, that it took months for the audit team to prove that the money had been returned to the HOA fund. Months of investigation. Months of Patricia's house being cordoned off with yellow tape while investigators examined her files. Months of the story spreading beyond Sycamore Heights. Local news picked it up, then regional outlets, and eventually a podcast about HOA tyranny in suburban America featured Patricia as the central case study. The title of the episode was The Perfectionist. It made her sound like a monster. When she listened to it, a mistake, a terrible mistake, she realized that's exactly what she'd become. By the time the DA decided not to prosecute the fraud charge requiring clearer intent, Patricia's life was already destroyed, not by the justice system, but by the simple fact of being known. Her real estate agent sent a message. The house has received several offers, all significantly below asking price. I think it's best we accept one quickly before the market sentiment shifts further. Patricia stood in her kitchen one last time. The same kitchen where she'd watched the patrol boat appear on the horizon, the same kitchen where she'd felt so certain of her authority, and something inside her broke. She'd built a life on control. She'd built a community on fear disguised as standards. And when the smallest thing had challenged her certainty, the entire structure had collapsed, revealing that her power had only ever existed in the minds of people she'd intimidated. The moving trucks came on a Wednesday. None of the neighbors came out to watch. That might have been more merciful. 6 months later, Patricia rented a small apartment in a different state, Nevada, chosen specifically because it was far enough away that no one would know her history. She'd sold the house at a loss, paid out settlements, covered the legal bills, and what remained was a woman reduced to the barest version of herself. She didn't have her status. She didn't have her community. She didn't have the scaffolding of power that had held her together. What she had was time, and forced, brutal honesty. During her evenings in that small apartment, Patricia began writing. Not a journal. She was too ashamed for that, but something like a confession. She reconstructed every person she'd targeted, every violation she'd fabricated, every moment she'd enjoyed watching someone squirm under her authority. The pattern was impossible to deny once she looked at it directly. She'd started with legitimate violations, parking on grass, unauthorized additions. But somewhere around year 3, her standards had spiraled inward into obsession. She'd begun issuing citations for things that weren't wrong at all, simply because she needed the rush of correction, the small hit of power that came from making someone else change. She'd targeted younger families most often, families with children, families who'd seemed happy despite having less money, less status than she did. Every citation had been dressed up in the language of community protection, but the real motivation had been much uglier. She'd been jealous, she'd been afraid, she'd been lonely. Her only daughter had moved to Los Angeles and was barely in contact. Her husband had died 5 years into her HOA role, and instead of grieving or connecting with people, she'd thrown herself deeper into the work of control. She'd made her position into a person, and when that person was stripped away, there was nothing underneath but emptiness. Patricia didn't have a therapist. She couldn't afford one, and besides, who would take her case? Instead, she had her writing, her small apartment, and the crushing weight of understanding. She also had something she'd never expected, a phone call from Commander Martinez. His voice was professional but not unkind. "Ms. Holloway, this is Commander Daniel Martinez. I'm calling because the Navy's Community Relations Office just finished processing the incident from 6 months ago. There's been a formal determination about what happened." Patricia's heart seized. Criminal charges, civil suit. "We've reviewed the situation," he continued. "And while you did interfere with federal property, the circumstances suggest you acted out of ignorance rather than malice. We're not pursuing any action against you." She couldn't speak. "However," he said, and she could hear something in his voice that might have been pity, "I wanted to call you personally. I've learned some things about the pattern of your behavior in your community. I served in the Middle East. I've seen what happens to communities when one person seizes unchecked power. What you did, even if it was small, even if it was just an HOA, it's the same mechanism. Control disguised as rules." Patricia felt tears beginning, shameful tears she'd spent months suppressing. "I could pursue this further," he said. "I could make sure your name followed you everywhere, but I think you're already suffering the consequences of your own actions, and I don't believe adding my anger to that would change anything." He paused. "I hope you find a way to become someone better than who you were." The line went dead. That phone call became a turning point of a different kind. Patricia realized that her punishment wasn't coming from the system, it was coming from having to live with herself. She began volunteer work at a local community center, teaching financial literacy to people who couldn't afford formal education. She worked without recognition or authority. She helped people without correcting them. She learned their names and their stories without judgment. Slowly, incrementally, she became someone different. Not redeemed, she understood that redemption wasn't hers to claim, but less toxic, less destructive. A person learning, very late, what it meant to cause harm and spend the rest of her life trying to undo it. On the one-year anniversary of the incident, Patricia received a letter from the Sycamore Heights HOA. The new president, a kind man named Marcus Webb, had written to inform her that the board had established the Patricia Holloway Settlement Fund in her name. The fund would be used to provide legal assistance to residents who'd been unfairly cited or fined by HOA boards. It was meant as irony, she understood, a way of ensuring that even in absence, her name would represent cautionary warning about the abuse of power. She didn't feel angry about it. She understood it was justice, of a kind. The type that doesn't come from courts or institutions, but from the simple mathematics of consequence. Patricia never returned to Sycamore Heights. She never tried to rebuild the life she'd lost. Instead, she built something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more honest, a life where she knew her place and accepted her limitations. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. 2 years after Patricia Holloway stepped down from the HOA, Sycamore Heights underwent a profound transformation. It wasn't dramatic, no grand gestures or formal policy changes. Instead, it was the quiet undoing of tyranny. The new HOA president, Marcus Webb, implemented what he called the Dignity Protocol. Citations could only be issued for violations that had genuine impact on property values and community safety. Abstract concepts like visual harmony were eliminated entirely. No fine could exceed $100 without a formal hearing and external review. Every resident had the right to appeal any decision. The woman with the rose garden, Sandra Martinez, ironically sharing a last name with the commander, was elected to the HOA board. She'd spent 2 years attending every board meeting as a voice for residents, and her vindication came in the form of genuine community support. The first thing she did was propose that residents be allowed to plant gardens in their yards without restriction. The vote was 17-3. The community didn't entirely forgive Patricia, but they moved beyond her. The house she'd sold was purchased by a young family with 3 children. They painted the shutters a soft sage green, approved by the new standards, and planted a vegetable garden that Sandra helped them maintain. Children played in yards without fear of citations. Life returned to something resembling normal. But the story didn't disappear entirely. 2 years after the incident, a documentary filmmaker named Grace Chen reached out to everyone involved in the case. She was making a film about the quiet tyranny of HOA overreach, and the Sycamore Heights situation had become a cautionary tale in HOA circles nationwide. Grace interviewed Marcus Webb about the reforms. She interviewed Sandra Martinez about how violation by citation had felt. She even tracked down several residents who'd moved away, people who attributed their departure to Patricia's abuse. Then she found Patricia. It took 3 months of searching and negotiation, but Patricia agreed to be interviewed. She didn't do it for redemption. She was past that delusion. But because she understood that bearing witness to her own failure might help others recognize the same patterns in themselves. She sat across from Grace in a modest conference room, her appearance transformed by time and hardship. Her hair was gray now, untouched by dye. Her face had softer lines, earned by genuine exhaustion rather than discipline. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by self-awareness. "I believed I was protecting the community," Patricia said during the interview. "I told myself that every citation, every fine, every confrontation was necessary to maintain standards, but the truth is much simpler and much uglier. I needed to be in control. My daughter didn't call me. My husband had died. My life felt small and empty, so I made my authority large enough to fill it." Grace asked the hard question, "Do you think you'd act differently if you could go back?" Patricia considered this for a long moment. "I'd like to say yes. I'd like to believe I'd have that clarity, but I know myself well enough now to understand that I wouldn't. I was too afraid, too desperate, too convinced of my own righteousness. The only thing that changed me was having it all taken away." The documentary premiered at a film festival and was picked up by a streaming service. Within a week, it had been viewed by 500,000 people. Comments flooded in, people recognizing their own HOA presidents in Patricia's behavior, residents understanding that their fear had been intentionally manufactured, board members seeing the patterns and correcting course. Sycamore Heights became a case study in how to reform an abusive institutional structure. Other neighborhoods contacted Marcus Webb for advice. A legal advocacy group created a toolkit based on the reforms he'd implemented. Patricia Holloway's name became synonymous with the problem, but Marcus Webb's solutions became synonymous with the answer. 3 years after the incident, the Navy established a small memorial on base to the different forms of service that sustain communities. It included a framed copy of the citation Patricia had issued to the patrol boat with an explanatory plaque. A reminder that authority without accountability becomes tyranny, even in the smallest communities. Commander Martinez attended the dedication. So did Patricia Holloway. They didn't speak to each other. There was no need. The story had already told itself. Patricia watched as young naval officers studied the memorial, understanding a lesson about power and responsibility that had taken her a lifetime to learn. She saw in their faces the possibility that they would learn it faster, that her failure might save them from their own. It wasn't redemption. It was the smallest possible version of purpose, the knowledge that her fall had at least served as a warning. She left the base that day with a strange sense of peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of finally accepting that she'd done harm and that no amount of suffering on her part would change that. All she could do was bear witness to her own failure and hope that someone, somewhere, would learn from it rather than repeat it. Patricia Holloway never returned to public life. She never sought vindication or tried to rebuild her reputation. She lived quietly in Nevada, volunteering at the community center, helping people without judgment, accepting that her place in the world was no longer elevated or special. The last time anyone heard from her directly was in a letter to the HOA at Sycamore Heights, written 5 years after she'd left. To the residents of Sycamore Heights, I cannot ask for forgiveness because I have no right to it. What I can offer is my example, not as someone to emulate, but as a warning about the person you might become if you mistake control for care, fear for duty, and loneliness for righteousness. I failed you. I'm sorry. I hope you'll be kinder to each other than I was. It was signed simply, Patricia. The letter was framed and placed in the HOA office, right beside the charter. Not as a symbol of shame, but as a reminder that in communities, as in life, the smallest acts of power can cause the deepest wounds, and that the only path forward is humility, accountability, and the daily choice to be better. In Sycamore Heights, children played freely in yards with diverse and colorful gardens. Families painted their shutters in colors that made them happy. The community thrived not because it had perfect standards, but because it had learned that perfection was a prison, and that sometimes the most important rule is knowing when to stop enforcing rules. And in a small apartment in Las Vegas, a woman lived quietly with the consequences of her own choices, forever changed by a moment when she'd confronted something more powerful than her authority, the truth about herself.